in the classroom because I don't want to hold up your time.
Okay, but now we have a god-awful feedback.
Okay.
And I want to get going.
Go ahead and turn yours
So,
off. Turn
the
yours off.
11 ways that a real estate agent gets into trouble. And as I said earlier on, there's plenty of ways that people can get into trouble. But the ones that that are prevalent, I've kind of condensed down into this list. And now I put the handout into the text box here. And for those of you in the classroom, I think I did email it over there as well. But the first one that I want to go over is missing critical dates. And the one that comes up and really hurts people is the inspection period on an as-is contract. The as-is contract is, as you, by the name of it, doesn't give you any chance for repairs. So you can request repairs with an as-is contract, but there's no requirement for the seller to do repairs. Therefore, just asking for repairs on an as-is contract does not stop the clock on the inspection period. And so agents that were around over the sort of 5 years ago, they've sometimes got it into their head that as long as they ask for repairs on an as-is contract, then that would stop the clock and their buyer is still protected by the inspection period. But in reality, the repairs have to be requested and then agreed upon by the seller and reduced into an addendum signed by everyone for it to be enforceable. And sometimes buyers agents will let their buyers meander outside of the inspection period without getting the repairs tied down. And then the seller may change their mind. They may say one day that they're going to put a new water heater in, but the next day they don't. And if they're outside of the inspection period, then the buyer's going to be out of luck. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box to the right and see if any questions come up, and then I'll try and answer them as we go along. It's pretty distracting, so if I suddenly go blank, it's not that I've frozen up, it's just that I've seen a question and my little brain is ticking over. It's really disturbing that I can't see any of you. I just see your names, but I'm going to presume you're out there and I'm going to presume you're dressed up fully in your best clothing and the men are wearing jackets and ties. That's how I like to vision. Number two, so let's just talk about missing critical dates again for number one. Make sure you calendarize all your dates, that you know exactly when contingency periods are going to end, and then you act accordingly. We're going to talk about the loan approval period a little bit later on, because that's one of the dates that people really do get messed up in. And that comes about when you have let's say you have a 30-day loan approval period, and on day 31, 32, and 33, the seller under the current 5X contract has the ability to cancel the contract if the buyer has not given written notice that they either have loan approval or they're waiving loan approval. And the example I use is one which is stuck in my mind for a few years. It was very early on when this contract was first written, and it involved baseball players in St. Petersburg. One baseball player had made an offer on a property, on a condo, and it was at 1.2 million in financed. And another baseball player was sitting in the wings, in the dugout, and he had a 1.4 cash backup waiting to go. We get to day 29 and the buyer's agent on the other side of the deal, we had the listing, the buyer's agent on the other side of the deal was not keeping an eye on his dates. At the end of day 30, we had not heard from the buyer whether or not that they had loan approval or they were waiving loan approval. And then the day, as soon as the clock struck midnight on the 30th day, the seller's agent sent a release and cancellation to the buyer's agent, who'd been absent for 22 and a half days, with the release and cancellation, moved to the backup cash offer, and everybody got annoyed. So at 8:30 the next morning, when the agent fell out of bed and saw the release and cancellation in his inbox, him and his broker immediately called me and said, "What the heck's going on?" And I said, "Well, it was day 30 yesterday. We hadn't heard from you. haven't heard from you for 22 and a half days. The lender hadn't been responsive really. And therefore, the seller is exercising their right to cancel under the 31, 32, and 33 day. So that's a great lesson, because God knows how much commission he lost by not keeping an eye on the clock. And we've had it happen to us as well. So, you know, I'm done it to some people, and we've had it done to us as well. So it's a real thing that happens. So the question from Susan is, can you ever change time? Well, time is always midnight, and with one exception. So let's just cover the time question as it's come up, and it is the most prevalent question in my life. Time is measured in the Real Estate 5X contract, same as is a standard, as calendar days. And a calendar day starts at midnight and ends at midnight. So every piece of paper that's on your fridge door that has a month and a number on it is a calendar day. A business day is Monday through Friday. A holiday is a public holiday defined by US code, whatever it is, 6103. And that gives all those days that we have a day off or we don't get a day off, or the kids are off school. But they're listed in the US code. If the last day of the period, if it hasn't been altered by any other addendum, ends on a weekend or holiday, then it jumps till 5 p.m. the next business day. Now, you could alter it by addendum. So you could say the inspection period has been extended until 4:30 p.m. on Thursday. That's fine. You could alter terms in the contract by an addendum. So you don't always have to have it as 12 midnight. I see it sometimes when they're extending escrow periods. So we've had a 3-day escrow period. If the executed date, which is day 0, was Monday, day 1 would be Tuesday, 2 Wednesday, and 3 Thursday. If you wanted to extend it to Friday because the buyer was having a problem, you could extend it to 5 p.m. rather than midnight on Friday. You could tighten the time down by that. So hopefully that answered your question. So understanding the absolute nature of time and time periods in the contract is, again, number one asked question, and one of the top, and this is in no particular order on these 11, but that is one of the ones that causes real estate agents lots of problems. Time. Number 2, I have an expression that I use, and I use it constantly. I used it, I think I've used it in every career I've been in. You know, this world is transactional and not emotional. In business is transactional and not emotional. We have a job to do, which is getting someone from buying or selling a house to the closing table and achieving that objective. There should be no emotion in it. We are transaction brokers, and on some occasions we're single agents, but we are unemotional. All we have to do is follow the contract. We don't have to do anything other than that. The problem is, by nature, we get emotional. And with the communication, we end up using language in our emails, which is emotional, or it's rhetorical, sarcastic, and it ends up being in trouble. I went to the board with a complaint against an agent who I was trying to defend unsuccessfully, because they provided so much evidence against them. They got into a texting war at 9 o'clock at night over, I think it was what property was going to be left in at the walkthrough. They hadn't even done the walkthrough, and they were having an argument about what was going to be left in the property. And there was, when we got to the board, the other agent had printed out all the texts that our agent had sent. And it was like he rolled out this carpet of abuse that was going backwards and forwards. It was like someone had just drunk half a bottle of Absolute and got onto the computer keyboard and battered away. And it solved nothing, because the transactional nature of the argument would have been to have gone to the walkthrough the next day, seen that the property that they were arguing about isn't there, and then holding up the closing, or going to a 125% escrow holdback, or whatever they were going to do. But arguing at 8 o'clock at night in a vodka-fueled rage is not going to get anyone anywhere. Okay. There is an app that you can use to retain all your texts. I strongly advise you to do that, because you're supposed to keep all records and all communications. And when they talked about keeping records of communications, most probably text messages weren't even thought of. So now that we do have text messaging, and agents like to do some texting business, make sure you, and I can't remember what the name of the app is, but I'm sure if you Google it, it just retains all your texts onto your hard drive of your computer, so you can pull them up if you needed to. And they sometimes can save your bacon. Post-closing defects and disputes. This is actually the second most asked question is, my buyer has just called me. We closed last Friday, and they have found out from the neighbors that the property has got termites and the seller did not disclose it. Or the swimming pool has a leak, or there was a sinkhole in the backyard once. All number of things that the seller has not disclosed. One last week was the pool company left a magnet on the metal cabinet in the garage where the pool on-off switch was, and the magnet was just their phone number. Well, after a couple of days in the property after buying it, the buyer calls that pool company because, hey, they're advertising, let me give them a call, because their pool had gone down about 6 inches. So he called the pool company and said, hey, my pool's gone down 6 inches. The pool company didn't know that the property had been sold, and said, well, did you take the hose out that we put in for you? Good evidence there. Good evidence that the seller failed to disclose the fact that there was a massive leak in the pool and was keeping it topped up prior to closing, and then removed the hose at closing. Why they think they're going to get away with that, I don't know. So what's our responsibility as a real estate agent when you get that call is to do absolutely nothing. So what normally happens before they take this class, agents will get on their computer and become LA Law, and they'll start firing off emails. I demand you to bring back the cabinet, or I demand you to come and fill in this sinkhole. If you don't, we're going to pay $5,000. We're going to sue you, all that. As soon as you put your little sweet fingers on the keyboard, you are practicing law without a license. And that is a felony. And it can get you 6 months downriver in the big house, or it can give you, I think it's about 100 grand fine. And when lawyers get hold of real estate agents that are taking their job away, they don't focus on the sinkhole or the leaking pool. They're more concerned with getting you locked up for your illegal, unlawful practice of law. So I have a script, and if you have something like this crop up, just text me and I'll text you back the script that you say to your buyer. And it says, it's something like, you know, I'm glad you reached out to me because it gives me an opportunity to assist you. The problem is I cannot now make any demands of the other side. I can ask the listing agent for the seller's contact information, but I strongly advise you to speak to a lawyer, because if I start meddling around, I might ruin any case that you might have against this seller. I'm willing to provide you with all the paperwork we have from the transaction, but I strongly advise you to speak to an attorney. And if you get a letter from an agent or an email from another agent with lots of demands after closing, send it to me and I'll give you the response that you can send to them. The thing is, we want, it's customer service versus legality. And we want to do the greatest thing for our customers, but our job ends at the closing table as far as that transaction. And we can't be dealing with stuff afterwards. Everybody still here? Everybody's with me? Good. I didn't even look for an answer then. I'm just presuming you are. So Use of paragraph 20 in the contract is the next one. That causes great consternation. It's normally a place where agents go to die. If you start writing in paragraph 20, 9 times out of 10, you're likely to be practicing law without a license. 9 times out of 10, you may get away with it. But there are some times when you don't. And you might be hauled up for something else, and then they take a look at the paperwork and see that you've written addenda or you've written in paragraph 20 stuff that was unlawful, illegal legal practice, unlawful, unlicensed legal practice. Things that I've seen which have actually caused agents problems have been writing lease terms in paragraph 20. And we come to lease terms as I think that's the 11th way real estate agents get into trouble. But as soon as you write something that gives someone else rights over someone else's property, you're practicing law. If you write stuff that is going to take place after closing, you're likely to be practicing law. The few things that you can write in paragraph 20 are if they've been written by an attorney and they've asked you to put them in, the parties have asked you to transpose that into paragraph 20. Or, and we're talking about the additional terms, or you're asking for closing costs and prepaid items to be paid for by the other side. So that will be an example of what you could put in the additional terms. But we've seen some pretty crazy things in there. And sometimes I think, why did you write that? Because you have a perfectly good rider to use. A case in point is, I saw one the other day that said, this contract is contingent upon the sale of the buyer's house at so-and-so. Well, that's great, but it's incomplete and it's put everything at risk. Why not use rider V, which has far more exact wording and gives everyone an out if the buyer's property doesn't sell? And how do they get out? And when is they going to get out? So be very, very careful. The other thing is badly written addenda, which we'll get to at number 8, I think, or number 6, no? Number 8. Next, failing to disclose known defects. We all know about the Johnson v. Davis case, which was the basis of residential disclosure with defects. I am still, to this day, asked, shall I disclose this? And I know Brian in the sales meeting said, was that the most asked question? It's not the most asked question, but it's the easiest one to answer. Yes, is the answer. Yes, shall I disclose it? Yes. I'm never going to say no, you're not going to disclose it, unless it's something which you do not have to disclose by law. So we have to disclose everything to do with the property. The general rule is we don't have to disclose things to do with the people that are in the property unless we're directly asked. For example, has anybody died in this house? If you know, you say yes, because the neighbors are going to tell them anyway. Does it affect anything? No. Do we have to disclose it up front? No. In some states, you have to disclose if there was ghosts in the house. I'll give you 10 guesses which state that is. Begins with C and ends with California. We do not have a ghost law here. We do not have a murder-suicide law here. My wife, who's a real estate, or was a real estate agent, she sold a house, listed a house, and it still had the outline of the murder scene on the carpet in the front room. And people that came in, some people asked what it was, some people didn't. And when asked, she had to say yes, but it was not something that was disclosed up front. It had to be disclosed up front. But if it's anything to do with the property, you have to disclose it. There's a great case which we had here in Claremont, which is where I'm based. where a real estate agent lived in the neighborhood after the 2005 hurricanes. The three, I think it was, that came through was Charlie, Francis, and Jean. Two of them swathed through Claremont. And this wonderful real estate agent went outside on the day after the hurricane and helped neighbors clear up, leaving his business card everywhere, doing everything that possibly he could to help and to promote himself as a real estate agent. So much so that several months later, he was asked to list a house at the end of the cul-de-sac where he lived. This house had roof damage during the hurricane. However, it had been fixed. And I see in the text box, this question came up, so it's timely. The roof damage had been fixed. However, moisture had got into the house from the roof damage and had created mold, which was missed by the inspector. Was there a defect in the property that had to be disclosed that couldn't have been readily seen by an inspection? The answer was yes, there was a defect in the property. It had a new roof. Even though it had been fixed, a new roof or a new piece of the roof had been fixed, it should still be disclosed that it happened. If they had disclosed it, the real estate agent would still have his own home and he'd still have his real estate license. Because the fact that they knew about it and didn't say anything meant that a more thorough investigation wasn't taken and the mold would have been found. What the court did was, it was pretty abrupt. The court fined the real estate agent $60,000 and gave them 24 hours to pay or come up with a means to pay or face jail. So he actually had to sell his own house to pay for the fine. And I still see him in town here, and he's not in real estate anymore. And in talking to him after the case, back then I wasn't doing this kind of thing, but I talked to him after the case and asked him, tell us about it, because it was big news in town. And he didn't work for Keller Williams. And he said it was, they did think that they didn't really have to disclose it, but never played it forward that the neighbors would say, oh yeah, there was a massive hole in that roof, and that is why there was mold. They just said, yes, there was a roof leak, yes, it was fixed, then that would have prompted the buyer to do more investigation and therefore not have just assumed that the roof was fine. I hope that all makes sense. I went off on a rant about 60,000 selling a house. Non-permitted work is one that a lot of agents miss, and if the work isn't permitted, so they put in an improvement to the property which they didn't get permits for, that must be disclosed. Unless it's fairly obvious, like they've got, they've done I think there's nothing that's fairly obvious. If you've done a garage conversion, and you haven't had it permitted, and not many people have. So if you're the buyer's agent, you're going to ask the seller, did you get this permitted? And if you're the seller's agent, you should be saying to them, hey, if you didn't permit this, it's best to disclose it. And the manner of disclosure should more than likely be the seller's real property disclosure. And I strongly advise you, if there's any defects that you're disclosing in a seller's real property disclosure, don't put it as an attachment on the MLS. The reason is, in Sarasota, and I'm sure it happens everywhere else, the permit and code enforcement people troll the MLS. They look at these sellers' disclosures. They look at photographs on the MLS. We had one listing in Sarasota which ended up with a red note on the door saying no one's allowed to do anything until we've contacted the city, because they noticed on the MLS photos that an interior wall had been removed, and they noticed that it wasn't done with it, or was done without a permit. So just be guarded. If you have stuff in the seller's real property disclosure, then send it by email to any prospective buyers. Don't put it as an attachment in MLS unless it's clean. Or you've got the seller's consent to put it in there. Next one, verbal versus written. The statute of frauds says that all contracts can be verbal or written, with the exception of certain types of contract. And the certain type of contract that we're interested in is anything to do with real estate. So if I said to you, you give me $5 and tomorrow morning I will take you to the airport, that is an enforceable verbal contract. I've offered, you've accepted, there's consideration, and we could actually take that to court and sue if you didn't take me to the airport. I don't take you to the airport. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, real estate is about written contracts. So everything must be written and must be signed. What we must understand is that the contract is king. The only thing that we are worried about is the contract or the addenda. The one that catches agents out the most is the MLS. And I know you belong to lots of different MLSs, but the majority of people work with Stella. And I see in Stella things like the dishwasher is not going to remain. So, dishwasher is one of those things that's pre-printed in the contract. So it would need to be excluded in the contract if it wasn't going to remain. And then on the final walkthrough, when we get there and the dishwasher's gone and the buyer says, where's the dishwasher? And the seller says, oh, it was excluded. We clearly put it in MLS that the dishwasher wasn't going to stay. So does it help anyone? No, it doesn't, because the MLS doesn't mean a thing. The MLS is advertising, it's fluff. So if you're going to have a dishwasher that's not going to convey, or a washer and dryer that is going to convey, it has to be put into the contract for it to be enforceable. So text between agents, unless all the terms and conditions are in those texts, which is very, very unlikely, then they're going to be invalid form of contract. We need to have everything on an addendum to the contract or the contract itself. And as I put in I think I put in the handout, I don't have the same handout as you, I just have a few notes here, but I think I put in there that expression of contract is king. I've had that written on my office wall because I get that question, number 3 question. I have this, we talked about it, we have a text about it, the contract is king. So make sure that you've got it in the contract. Number 7, I've got failing to identify and what stays and what goes. On Fridays, some Fridays are worse than others, but normally on a Friday, my calls and questions are about final walkthroughs, or Thursday nights, final walkthroughs. Sally mentioned calling at 4 a.m. I'm asleep by 8 o'clock every night. I'm up at 4 a.m. So if you call me at 8:30, I'm most probably not going to be around. But sometimes on a Thursday night, we get calls about, I've got to the final walkthrough and this has gone or this has stayed. So, example, rotten, stinky, dirty refrigerator in the garage. Unless it's specifically excluded in the contract, it should be there on Thursday night when they do their final walkthrough. So if the buyer doesn't want that refrigerator that's in the garage, make sure it gets excluded. If the buyer does want the washer and dryer, which is not pre-printed in the contract, make sure that is included in the contract. I thought that I would get through the whole of January without talking about washers and dryers on a call. And yet I had a washer and dryer the other day with an agent that's been in the business for 15 years. And she didn't add it into the contract because she thought that, it said it in the MLS that the washer and dryer was going to stay. So she didn't put it in the contract. Now, I'm not blaming her. I mean, agents have a million things to think about. All I've got to think about is 12 pages of a contract. But you'd think by now that every single agent in Florida would have washer and dryer tattooed on their arm, because it's the one thing that will cost you some money, because at some stage it feels like everyone seems to mess up on it. I've got a question here. Leslie Brown, going back to the first scenario you talked about, when the seller cancels due to no loan approval, the buyer does get their deposit back. If a seller cancels 31, 32, and 33, if it's a 30-day period, if it's 45 period, then it'd be 46, 47, 48. They do give the buyer back their deposit. Good question. Then, what else was there? Oh, drapes. We get little sad old ladies on Fridays that they're selling, and they've got these beautiful drapes that were handed down from pioneer days, heirloom drapes, Sally and I call them. And they're very sad to find out that the buyer is entitled to keep them, because in the contract says that the drapery stays. So when you're a listing agent and you're walking the house, one of the teams that I was coaching, they would have the whole house would be covered in yellow post-its, because they'd do stay and go. They'd ask questions. The garage shelving, is it staying or is it going? The heirloom drapes, staying or are they going? If they're going to go with the seller, then either remove them now from the property before you put it on the market, or have a big file that you remember to make sure that on the contract you're going to have those exclusions, because people get really sad and they just end up taking them, and there's end up to being a dispute. Sometimes we don't close, and you know that the only people that are going to make money are those darn attorneys. So let's not give them any more money. Let's just make sure we do our job and keep it really clear as to what's here and what's not. Next, the poorly written addenda, a plural of addendum. The one thing that I see a lot is that you cut and paste, not you, because I've never seen your contracts, so you're perfect. But I see a lot of people that they cut and paste the inspection report and stick it on a piece of paper and say, the buyer wants this. Well, that isn't going to fly. Every broker I talk to has the same argument and pain about this. Florida Realtors have written an article about this. If you're asking for repairs in an addendum on an as-is contract, the first thing the judge is going to say, if you go to court on it, is this was an as-is contract. So your variation of that contract by an addendum must be pretty near perfect. And the best way to write it is to think of it as handing it to someone on the street and having them explain it to you exactly what it means. Someone who doesn't know anything about real estate, doesn't know anything about houses, and ask them to explain it to you. You can practice on your kids, your dog, your uncle, but look at it and say, does this make sense? And it's going to be what is being repaired, who is going to repair it, when it's going to be done by, how it's going to be done, and that all warranties and receipts are going to convey. I see things like fix bathroom faucet. Great. Well, what's wrong with the bathroom faucet? Who's going to fix it? Et cetera, et cetera. The worst one I saw on this cost the agent his commission. And it was the only way that we could really stop ourselves from getting out of jail. The addendum said the seller will replace the air conditioner. With what would be the question I would have had. And truly, this is what happened. They had a certain power AC, and the inspector said, look, this is a 4,000 square foot house. This AC is only good for 33,000 square foot. So the buyer and seller agreed that they would replace the AC. And the agent wrote up, or actually before they even agreed, he sent over the addendum. It said, the seller agrees to replace the AC. That's all it said. So the seller did replace the AC, replaced it with a used, same powered one as they had before, and got Bob from down the street to bolt it to the concrete outside. Get to closing day walkthrough, and of course, buyer is extremely unhappy. And then firstly, they're extremely unhappy with their agent because they wanted a brand new Ream 3.0 overhead cam didgeridoo AC that would be good enough for a 4,000 foot home. and the $12,000, I think it was, commission was the only way that the agent could appease their crazy buyer from taking them to court. So be very exact and be very purposeful in writing repair addendum. On number 9, closing missteps, the final walkthrough, transfer of warranties, missing property, tenants, all those things come up on closing day. Tenants are perfectly and adequately dealt with in the contract in paragraph 6B and standard D of the contract. So any tenants that are in there, just tell the buyer to look at paragraph 6B, then to look at standard D, and then execute what those 2 items in the contract say. Don't be writing anything, any addendum talking about contracts, leases being transferred or security deposits being transferred. That's all taken care of in standard D of the contract with an estoppel letter. And the whole business with keys, there was so much argument about keys and who owns the property that 2 weeks ago, Florida Realtors, Joel Maxon, one of the attorneys at Florida Realtors, wrote a nice article about who owns the day of closing and when do we give up the keys. I'm not going to, it's a long discussion, so I'm not going to go into it now because I want it to be exact. But if you didn't read that, it was worth reading. And then when we get you guys into the broker forum, we have a lot of those resources in that Facebook broker forum. But all those closing day woes could have been avoided, all the ones that I deal with, could have been avoided by the agents communicating thoroughly with their parties. In this day and age, I think if I was a listing agent, I would be saying to my seller, I want to give you a heads up. Loans are not getting approved in 30 days. We're not getting things closed in 30 days, and especially in this Central Florida. I don't know your market as well, but we're having a lot of problems because, one, lenders are so overwhelmed that they can't get stuff done. The cities are shut down, so we can't get permit searches done. And so we just want to, the realism is to talk to the parties and just say, if you can be flexible. When the buyer comes and asks for an extension because it's still in underwriting, hopefully we can be flexible. Obviously, if we've got a chain reaction of closings, then it's not going to work. But sometimes agents get in the fight because, one, sometimes they want their commission for their mortgage payment, so they're trying to dig their heels in to get it closed on the 27th, 28th. When in reality, a couple more days, it would get closed and nobody would be unhappy. So it's just setting realistic expectations. I'm going to look at the box on it because it's just distracting me. So I'm going to take a look at the box for some questions in a minute. But permit searches, too little, too late. Permit searches should be done, must be done within the inspection period on an as-is contract. It seems to be that that people presume that the title company are going to do a permit search, and that's not always the case. Some title companies do permit searches, some don't. Permit search is the responsibility of the buyer during the inspection period. There's nowhere in the contract that gives them the right to cancel if they find that there are open or expired permits on the property. So get that done early if it's important to the buyer. For me, I've never really been worried about it when I've been buying properties. I know some people do. Some cities, they're a little bit stricter on permits. But if I have the conversation with the buyer and say, look, if you're concerned about open or expired permits, then go to the city and get your permit search done. Or we have a guy in Claremont, Steve, who you give him $25 and he goes to the city. He does all the permit searches. And then he reports back to the buyer and gets you out of the liability circle. So don't wait until the end of the transaction to suddenly find out about permits and have an unhappy buyer. The same with the HOA. The HOA rules and regulations cause me headaches. There's one HOA in Sarasota that says no pickup trucks. Well, God bless America. I thought we had to have pickup trucks. I thought that was the rules. But this HOA says no pickup trucks after 5 p.m. at night. Well, this didn't get found out until the buyer had read the regulations halfway through the transaction. And there's no out. The only way that you can cancel if you don't like the HOA rules is during the inspection period. But if you're using a standard contract, you have to do that research before you go under contract, because you cannot cancel a standard contract if you don't like the HOA rules. And we have people that go under contract with the standard form, the 5, they suddenly read the HOA rules and find out that they can't keep their boat on the driveway and wish to cancel. And there's no ability to cancel just because they don't like the rules. So remember, standard contract before you go in to get executed. Get a hold of the HOA rules, have the buyer get a hold of them if they can. Be very wary if the seller provides them, because we don't know if they're the latest edition. And if you want an as is, take a good look at them during the inspection period. Right, that makes a lot of sense. And then number 11 is writing leases. And I call them hidden lease terms. If you think about it, when you go to U-Haul and you rent a lockup unit, you're writing a lease. So just remember that. So when you go to U-Haul or a Servview, whatever it is, storage units, you are executing a lease between yourself and someone else to store property. So bearing that in mind, when you write a clause which says the seller will leave their Cadillac sedan in the garage for 3 days after closing, you're writing a lease. And writing a lease is a felony if you're not an attorney. The only lease that you can write is to fill in the blanks on a Florida Realtors lease. So be very guarded about these hidden lease terms, that you're not in fact giving property rights from one person to another. And how this comes about is bizarre. And I know agents do it all the time and get away with it. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of ones that we dealt with where they didn't get away with it. One was the Airstream, the big Diet Coke can on wheels that the person had at the bottom of their yard. And it was muddy and rainy the week before closing. And the seller said to the buyer, if I tow this Airstream out of here, it's gonna tear up the lawn. So can we wait until the weather gets dry and then I'll come round and get it? So the agents with the best will in the world decided to write up an addendum which said the seller will leave their Airstream 30-foot Excella trailer at the back of the property against the fence, and on or before the 22nd of the next month, they will come and recover said Airstream, which they did. They came and recovered it when the land dried out and took it for a drive across the septic, and boom, 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 boom. So who's the insurance? Who's paying for this? Who's going to be dealing with this? Where's the lease? Where is the permission document that allowed this person to have? And they look at what the realtor wrote, and nobody's going to be happy. The other one was one of my favorites, this one. Not the agent, not laughing at the agent's expense, it was just the fact that someone would actually do this. But the buyer asked the seller asked the buyer if they could stay there the night of closing. And the buyer's, sure, that's not a big deal. We're not going to move in until next week anyway. Of course you can. There'd been a nice transaction. So on the night of closing, our agent wrote, a nice little addendum, a little illegal lease, which said the seller will remain in the property the night of closing. So the seller had a wonderful goodbye party with all their friends and trashed the place. I mean, there was drywall broken, there were doors broken, there was all kinds of craziness that happened. Who's going to pay for it? And so, yeah, how do we find out who's going to pay for it? We'd look to the terms of the lease, which allowed one person to have the property rights for another person, and all we had was 2 lines which said the seller can stay in the property from the night of closing. So it comes back on you as the agent when we do that. So we want to be very, very careful. And I don't want to make light of the agent's peril in these, but they're always good teaching points, and I'm never going to name them. And sometimes they're not even Keller Williams agents, but we have to be very, very careful what we do. And how do we do it correctly? If the buyer says, I want to stay in the property, if the seller says I want to stay in the property the night of closing, if we know that at the beginning of the transaction, we use rider U, which is the seller's post-occupancy, and then we send them both away to an attorney to get the post-occupancy agreement drawn up. We don't draw it up. And if the buyer wants to go in early, we use rider T, which is the pre-occupancy by the buyer, and then we have an attorney write up the lease of the pre-occupancy. Obviously, it's not a good situation to have. Having people in property that's not theirs, and there's a lot of liability for everyone involved. So we try and discourage it as much as possible. If you try and use rider T and U once you're executed, you do open up the door for the parties to cancel if they don't come to some agreement. So just be guarded as when you use rider T and rider U, because of that opening the cancellation window up. I'm always available to talk to you about that, and most of the time, if someone's going to stay in before or after, then we're going to make sure that we get someone somewhere that's not us to write up a good agreement between the parties. They can always write it up themselves if they want to take that risk, but we're not going to be the ones that write it up for them. Let me think of some other things. The things that I've got a few more minutes before I lose my time slot. The other thing that agents are getting into trouble for is this whole clear cooperation thing. I haven't had a chance to read the rules of all your MLSs yet, but Stellar MLS, the clear cooperation follows the NAR guidelines, and I'm sure most of them do. Excuse me. But agents are starting to market properties, stick signs in the yard when there's no exclusion form. So we just need to be very careful that we do stay within the clear cooperation guidelines and rules. The other I don't know if you have this on your handout, but the loan approval process is most probably it's the most mismanaged. And I said earlier on, I was going to circle back and talk about it. It's the most mismanaged paragraph in the contract. Paragraph 8 is fairly simple. It says, person's got to apply for a loan within a certain amount of time. They've got to get loan approval within a certain amount of time. And the lender and the seller have got to provide info. So the seller and the seller's agent are to be given information by the lender as to the progress of the loan. And then once they get their loan, it's a transaction between a buyer and seller. The lender's not party to this contract. The buyer has to tell the seller that they have loan approval. There's no mention in there of loan commitment. There's no mention in there of a lender's loan commitment. Loan approval is the buyer telling the seller that they have loan approval or they're waiving loan approval. And when I say buyer, when I say seller, that means the agents as well. So the listing agent receiving a letter, an email from the buyer's agent saying the buyer has loan approval is sufficient for that paragraph 8. There's no, I want to see something from the lender in writing. All the lender has to do is to just give information about the progress of the loan, nothing to do with loan approval. Be very, very careful that you don't fall into that trap. We have lenders give loan approval, and all it does is confuse the situation. And that is the JetBlue pilot. The JetBlue pilot was a young lady who was based in Fort Lauderdale. She was given a promotion and was being moved to Orlando. She got a husband, was really excited. They came up from Fort Lauderdale because she was not going to have to be moving around anymore. She was coming up to the JetBlue training base in Orlando. She's going to be here for 3 years. She's going to buy a house. Found a beautiful house, one of our listings, and she had a beautiful buyer's agent who was one of our buyer's agent, who was also on the same team who had the listing. So the 400 grand house, day 29 of the loan approval period, the pilot goes to talk to human resources in Fort Lauderdale, who say, you know, we're going to stop your move. We want you to head up our new Central America routes as the chief pilot. So you don't need to move from your house in Fort Lauderdale. You will not be living in Orlando, is basically what they said. So the lender doesn't know this information. And the seller, being very diligent, calls the lender and says, hey, how's this loan going? It's loan approval day, pretty much. And the lender says, yes, she has loan approval. There or thereafter, the pilot calls her lender up and says, hey, I'm not moving to Orlando, therefore the residency requirement for the loan isn't going to work out. I'm going to cancel. So she cancels. And it caused the seller to be confused. The buyer was entitled to have their escrow back because they had said that they did not get loan approval within the 30 days. The seller thinks that she had given loan approval, and therefore if she cancels after she'd given loan approval, that he keeps the escrow. And it took about 8 weeks for him to come around, and I'm sure it cost everyone a lot of money and time, but he was relying on the lender giving loan approval, and it shouldn't have been. He should have been relying on the buyer themselves giving loan approval. So wasted time. Our agents did the best they could in the circumstances, but we just had a very strong-willed seller who refused to get legal advice and just hung on to the escrow. In the end, we had to get an attorney to write to him. The buyer had to get an attorney to write to him and make untold threats and get him to realize, I can't give him legal advice. Even as the broker, I can't give him legal advice. I took him through paragraph 8 so he could self-discover it, but he still didn't see the difference between the buyer and the mortgage person. And he was just convinced he got loan approval. So we have to be very, very careful. I have a couple of questions, one question, and that is, should you use the addendum form always, or emails okay as addendum? Emails are never okay as addendum, because unless you can get, and now I'm just going to say no, don't. It's the mechanics of making it legal far outweigh the benefits of making it legal. So no, you should use an addendum, which a form or any piece of paper that says this is an addendum to the contract dated on such and such a date, and the parties agree to the following. Because what you're doing, you're changing. An addendum is an additional change to the original contract. So it must be clear with that form, that's the intent of that piece of paper. And again, just think about the man on the street, or the girl on the street that you hand something to and say, what do you think this means? And that an email wouldn't suffice. What other questions do you have? We are 3 minutes ahead of time. Perfect. Nothing? Am I muted for an hour? Sally, are you still in there? Okay, well, hopefully you've got the handout, and Sally's going to be doing this class next week, which is the differences or between the standard and the standard and the as-is contract, which is a great class because I'm coaching agents to use the standard contract every time they can. Because if you were the listing agent, I wouldn't, especially in the market where there's multiple offers, if I was a listing agent, I would want the standard contract. I just sold a townhome that I own, and I asked for the standard contract. One, it weeds out the agents that don't know what they're doing. Two, you may have an agent that doesn't know what they're doing and they actually write the standard contract, and it gives a great advantage to the seller. It holds the buyer's feet to the fire, so you're not driving them around showing them houses and they just cancel in the inspection period. And other tips and tricks that Sally will give you in that class. I love that class. I have emailed the handout to Miss Danielle, and I will email it again. If I didn't, I might have not have done, but I'll email it again to someone. And to repeat what we should put in paragraph 20, it's not what we should put, it's just the only thing you really should put if it is relevant, is that if the buyer wants to request closing cost or prepaid items to be paid by the seller. And you could write a couple of paragraphs concerning that. Thank you, Danielle. It's been fun. I look forward to actually getting over and seeing you guys and getting to shake some hands. Oh, I've got one more question. I'm not going to go if I've got a question. How about sight unseen offers? How to handle? You know, there's no form, there's no format for sight unseen. It's one of those beautiful terms where you could actually spell it either way. You can spell it S-I-G-H-T, meaning they never have seen it, or you can spell it S-I-T-E, which means the sight was unseen of the property. Love that phrase. There's no special form. If someone wants to make an offer without seeing the property, it's entirely up to them. Buyer beware. They have an inspection period, so they can use that time. I would never use I would advise the parties never to use a standard contract if they weren't going to see the property before they made the offer. Okay, folks, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.